Title: Fix It Now. The Paria divers deserve justice, not promises. On February 25, 2022, the unthinkable happened beneath the waters at Point Pierre. 5 men, Fyzal Kurban, Kazim Ali Jr, Yusuf Henry, Rishi Nagassar, and Christopher Boudram, entered a pipeline to do their jobs. Only one of them came back alive. The others, sons, fathers, husbands, died in darkness, calling for help that never came. Trinidad and Tobago wept. But the tears of a nation are not enough. Justice has a price, and it remains unpaid. It has now been over 3 years since the Paria diving tragedy. And while ministers moved on, new governments were elected, and speeches filled the air, the families of those divers are still waiting for the promises to mean something. When it mattered, the People's National Movement, PNM, failed to act. On April 3, 2024, then Prime Minister Stuart Young announced a cabinet decision to offer $1 million ex gratia compensation to each grieving family and the lone survivor. But it never came. They made the promise, but not the payment. While in opposition, the United National Congress, UNC, made bold, unwavering declarations. Kamla Persad-Bissessar, alongside attorneys like Prakash Ramadar, stood with the families. They called the delay heartless, they called for justice, and they demanded answers. They made us believe that when they got into power, they would fix it. Now, they are in power. On May 8, 2025, Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar stood at her first post-cabinet briefing and promised mediation, transparency, and court oversight, a process welcomed, but not yet started. As of today, there is still no formal word from the Attorney General. Not $1 has reached the families. Not one signature confirms compensation. Not one parent, child, or widow can begin to truly heal. These families have suffered in silence, reliving the horror of that day, hearing their loved ones' last desperate gasps over and over in their minds. They have buried their husbands and sons without answers, without justice, without support. They are owed more than money, they are owed dignity, peace, and the assurance that their pain matters. And let us be clear, $1 million is not enough. No amount can bring back a father to his child or a son to his mother. But fair compensation can ensure these families don't have to struggle while the country turns the page. And it can send a message to every worker in Trinidad and Tobago that their lives are valued. To the UNC government, we beg you, fix it. You stood with these families when it was politically convenient. Now that you hold the power, use it for the people you vowed to protect. Do not let bureaucracy and delay become your legacy. Show the nation that we are not a country where workers die and are forgotten. If you fail to act now, you become no different from those you condemned. If you act, you can finally turn national grief into national healing. The blood of those divers stained more than a pipeline, it stained the conscience of a nation. And until justice is done, we are all still underwater. 1. Demand for transparency and parliamentary oversight. The UNC, through MPs such as Rudy and Darsing, publicly demanded that the full report from the Sharma probe, and later, the Lynch Commission of Inquiry, into the Paria diving tragedy be published and scrutinized by Parliament. Darsing insisted that the report should not be hidden or selectively released, but rather should be examined by Parliament's Standing Committee on Energy and Energy Affairs. The UNC framed their position as a rejection of any cover-up committee, emphasizing the need for public and parliamentary accountability in the handling of the tragedy and its aftermath. 2. Commission of Inquiry report laid in Parliament. On January 18, 2024, the Energy Minister, then Stuart Young, formally presented the Lynch Commission of Inquiry's 380-page report to the House of Representatives. This was in line with previous commitments that the findings would be made public and subject to parliamentary review. The report, which detailed the circumstances of the February 2022 tragedy, was also sent to the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, for consideration of any further legal action. The report's tabling in Parliament was a direct response to calls from the opposition, particularly the UNC, for transparency and for the findings to be accessible to both MPs and the wider public. 3. Calls for legislative reform and compensation. During parliamentary debates and media briefings, UNC MPs pressed the government to not only release the findings but also to consider amending the Occupational Health and Safety Act to impose stiffer penalties for breaches, reflecting the seriousness of the incident. The UNC also called for assurances that the families of the victims would be compensated fairly and promptly, and that any gaps identified in the report would be addressed through legislative or policy changes. 4. Compensation debate and cabinet decision. Parliamentary records reflect ongoing debate about the amount and nature of compensation for the families. The government, under the PNM, eventually announced an ex gratia payment of $1 million to each family and the survivor, a decision discussed in Parliament and justified by comparisons to awards for law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. The UNC, while in opposition, criticized delays and the lack of clarity on when payments would be made, urging the government to act swiftly and not let bureaucratic disputes between insurers delay justice for the families. 5. Ongoing oversight and future steps. The report's referral to the DPP was discussed in Parliament, with the government clarifying that any criminal or further investigative action would depend on the DPP's assessment. The UNC has continued to monitor the process, calling for the new administration, now themselves in government, to place this issue at the forefront and ensure that compensation and systemic reforms are implemented without further delay. In summary, the UNC's involvement in Parliament has been marked by persistent calls for transparency, accountability, and fair compensation for the Paria diving tragedy's victims. Their advocacy included demands for public scrutiny of inquiry reports, legislative reforms, and direct compensation for affected families. Now in government, the UNC is expected to act on these commitments and ensure that the matter is resolved both justly and transparently.